equals the sound between silence. I've always been sensitive to sound. As a child, I could hear conversations through walls that others couldn't, pick up frequencies from radios that weren't quite tuned in. My mother called it a gift. I learned to call it a curse. It started 3 months ago when I moved into the apartment on Elm Street. The rent was impossibly cheap for downtown, and I should have questioned why. The landlord, Mr. Henley, was eager to get me signed and moved in. Too eager, I realize now. The first few nights were blissfully quiet. I thought I'd finally found my sanctuary, a place where my hypersensitive hearing wouldn't torment me with every creak, whisper, and distant conversation. But on the 4th night, I heard it. A sound that wasn't quite a sound. It came from between the silence, in those microsecond gaps between the hum of the refrigerator cycling off and on, in the space between my own heartbeats. A whisper that felt like it was being spoken directly into my ear canal, but with words I couldn't quite catch. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it again. Nothing. Just the normal symphony of urban white noise that usually kept me awake. But I knew what I'd heard, even if I couldn't define it. The next day, I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Chen. She's lived in the building for 15 years, and I thought she might have insight into the building's quirks. When I described the sound, her face went pale. "You're in 4B, aren't you?" she asked, though she already knew. "The last tenant mentioned sounds too. Said they came from the walls." "What happened to the last tenant?" Mrs. Chen looked away. "She moved out suddenly. Middle of the night. Left all her furniture." That night, I paid closer attention. I sat in my living room with a notepad, trying to document when I heard the not quite sound. It seemed to happen most frequently between 2:17 and 2:43 a.m., always in those moments when the building itself seemed to be holding its breath. By the end of the week, I could almost make out words. They seemed to be in English, but spoken with an inflection that made them feel foreign, ancient. The voice, and I was becoming certain it was a voice, sounded neither male nor female, but something caught between the two. I started losing sleep, not from the typical noise sensitivity that had plagued me my whole life, but from anticipation. Every night, I found myself sitting in the dark, waiting for 2:17 a.m., listening for those whispers that seemed to come from inside the very air molecules around me. 2 weeks in, I began to understand fragments. "She hears us now," came through clearly one night. Another night, "The thin places are opening." But it was the third phrase that made me consider leaving. "We've been waiting so long for someone who could listen." I researched the building's history at the City Records office. The structure was built in 1952 on the site of a demolished medical facility, specifically, a psychiatric hospital that had been closed down in the 1940s after a series of patient deaths that were never adequately explained. The hospital had been experimenting with early forms of electroshock therapy and sensory deprivation. The more I learned, the more the whispers seemed to intensify. They were no longer confined to the early morning hours. I began hearing them in the spaces between words during phone conversations, in the gaps between songs on the radio, in the pause between my footsteps as I walked across the hardwood floors. 1 month after moving in, I realized the whispers weren't just random. They were responsive. When I thought about leaving, I heard, "She won't go. She can't go now." When I considered calling someone for help, who would believe the sound she hears? I tested this theory by thinking specific thoughts, and sure enough, the voices would respond, not to my words but to my intentions, my fears, my deepest concerns. It was as if living in this space had tuned me into some frequency where thought and sound intersected, where the boundary between my consciousness and whatever existed in those thin places was dissolving. The apartment began to feel different too. The walls seemed to pull slightly, so subtly that I questioned whether I was seeing it or imagining it. The temperature fluctuated without any correlation to the thermostat. And the silence, the blessed silence I'd initially cherished, began to feel heavy, pregnant with anticipation. I tried to leave. 3 times, I packed my belongings and prepared to break the lease. Each time, as I reached for the door with my suitcases in hand, the whispers would become a roar. Not loud in the conventional sense, but overwhelming in their clarity and urgency. "The threshold is crossed," they said. "The listening has begun. The listening cannot end." By the second month, I understood that I wasn't just hearing voices from some past trauma embedded in this place. I was becoming a conduit. The hypersensitive hearing that had always made me different was evolving, expanding beyond the normal spectrum of sound into something else entirely. I started hearing the voices of people in other apartments, not through the walls but through that same impossible space between silence. Mrs. Chen's loneliness. The college student in 2A's growing desperation about his failing grades. The couple in 3C whose marriage was disintegrating in slow motion. But those were just the living voices. The others, the ones that had been waiting, were becoming stronger, more insistent. They spoke of things that hadn't happened yet, showed me images in audio form of futures both mundane and terrible. I learned to fear sleep, because in dreams the boundary between hearing and experiencing disappeared completely. Last week, I realized I was no longer sure which thoughts were mine and which were being whispered to me. When I looked in the mirror, I could swear I saw subtle changes. My eyes seemed to be listening even when my ears weren't. My reflection appeared to be hearing things I couldn't yet perceive. Tonight, as I write this, the whispers have become constant. Not intrusive, exactly, but present like a second layer of reality running parallel to everything I see and touch. I understand now why the previous tenant left so suddenly, and why Mr. Henley was so eager to fill this particular apartment. The building needs someone who can hear, someone sensitive enough to serve as a bridge between what was, what is, and what's coming through those thin places the voices mentioned. I've become part of whatever experiment was started in the psychiatric hospital beneath us, an ongoing study in the spaces between sound and silence, between sanity and something far more complex. Tomorrow, I think I'll call Mr. Henley and ask him how long tenants typically stay in 4B. But I already know what the whispers will tell me about his answer before he speaks. They're always ahead of the sound now, always waiting in the space between intention and word, between thought and voice. And I'm beginning to understand that I'm not their victim. I'm their collaborator. The listening has become mutual, and I'm no longer sure who is the observer and who is the observed. The rent was cheap for a reason. The apartment comes with responsibilities I'm only beginning to comprehend.